Depression Webinar 2 for PEDS. Today we're going to have Dr. Anil Chacko present some really important content information, and we're also going to go over the dashboard again. So we're going to start. Anil, welcome. Thank you so much for participating with us and presenting information to all of our teams.
Fantastic. And everyone, Kara, can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, very good. Okay, great. So welcome everyone. My name is Anil Chacko. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Queens College, and I've been working with the CTAC group in one way or another for the past couple of years. And I have used the PEDS material clinically, primarily as a supervisor for the last year and a half to 2 years. So the goal today is two parts. I'm just going to move to the agenda here. We're going to talk a little bit about the dashboard and the measures and just make sure everyone is clear about how the process works and why it's important, and perhaps if we have some time to have a volunteer work with me in actually trying to start up a dashboard for a client. Once we get through that, we'll talk about key depression practice elements. It's going to be a broader, more in-depth review of the 3 practice elements that were reviewed at the last webinar. That includes CBT, self-monitoring, activity schedules, problem solving, and goal setting. And then we'll wrap up with next steps and hopefully have some time for question and answers. Just a quick question first is, before we get to this, is did you, just so we know in terms of who's attending and how many people are online, if you can just respond, did you log in alone or as a team for this webinar? And then the next poll question is, how confident do you feel using the MAP system for depression with your client? Very confident, somewhat confident, or not very confident?
The results for the first polling question are going to be on the right, and then we'll launch the second polling question.
Okay. So just let me know, Kara, when I can re-ask the second polling question.
Okay. So we have the results from the first polling question, did you log in alone or as a team? And it looks like most of you logged in by yourself. Thank you for answering that. So we can go to the next polling question now.
Okay, the next polling question should be viewed on your screen. It's, how confident do you feel using the MAP system for depression with your client? Very confident, somewhat confident, or not very confident? So you can take a minute just to respond to that question.
Okay, the results are on the right, and it looks like most of you feel either very confident or somewhat confident. That's really great to hear. We just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions or concerns about any of the content, that you can feel free to reach out to any of us. Our contact information will be on the last slide. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kara. So we're going to actually move forward in these slides because we're going to actually start with the dashboard. So here we are. This is slide 26, assessing baseline and progress monitoring. So I just wanted to make a couple of comments about the dashboard and the utility of the dashboard for clinical work. As was mentioned in the last webinar, the whole system is meant to be help or assist you in making decisions about treatment. And what's really important is we know that it's very difficult for both clients and for people just in general to be able to report on their behavior in the past. And that could be behavior, a month ago, 2 weeks ago, or even at times, depending on what you're asking, what happened yesterday. And so it's really important to be able to utilize the dashboard as a way of tracking information in the moment, or as frequently as possible, to be able to get a sense of the broader picture, the clinical picture for each client that you have, in order to make decisions about whether something is going well and you should continue to do what you're doing, if things aren't changing at all, or whether things are actually getting worse. And in the latter two instances, if something isn't changing or things just seem to be flatlining, or if things are getting worse, it's an opportunity to look back on what you've done, how well it's been covered, how well it's been implemented, and the barriers and challenges that might be associated with implementing certain practice elements. And so this can only happen in the context of collecting information, and not just any information, but information that's pertinent to your particular client, that's objective, and that can be easily tracked in order to make these kinds of decisions. As was discussed in the last webinar, there are many depression measures out there. You probably have something either as part of your clinic, in what's called a broadband measure, like the CBCL or the BASC, or very narrow measures like the couple that we have listed here, the CESD, the RCAS, and the PHQ-9, and those tend to be a bit more specific in terms of focusing on a certain disorder or two. These are the free depression measures that are available. They're psychometrically validated, meaning that they try and assess the construct of depression and or anxiety or other kinds of issues. These things are related to functioning in the real world, and so they are, even though they are self-report measures, they are capturing something that seems to be going on in the child's life. And so they have some utility for understanding what might be going on. So things that are free and that are psychometrically validated are probably pretty good in terms of cost effectiveness. So we would encourage you to consider these. And what's really important here is not just to say, okay, let's just pick the one that's the shortest, or pick the one that we already have access to, although that would not be a problem. It's really to be able to say, what's going to work for this particular client that I have? So for instance, the CESD may be appropriate for a broad range of kids. It includes self-reports. It gives you total scores for depression. Perhaps you have a kid who has both some anxiety and depression, and you're looking for one measure versus two to be able to assess both of those things at the same time. Perhaps you're looking for a measure that will give you not only a kid's self-report, but a report for the caregiver. So these are the kinds of decisions that need to be made in terms of deciding, well, what's the best measure for this particular client, given their age, given who you want information from. This is mentioned, again, this is sort of a rehash of the last webinar. Most measures that are what they're called sort of general nomothetic measures, we try to implement them as often as possible, and typically once a month seems to be important. And the reason for this is in order to actually be able to look at whether something is getting better or not, you need at least 3 assessments, right? That's the only way to look at a trend line. So 1 point will not necessarily give you much, but it will give you an understanding of where the person is starting off. The second time point, the second assessment, will give you at least some information about a particular trend, but it may actually not be very stable. It usually takes about 3 assessments to get some sense of, is the information you're getting from a measure like the CESD telling us something about the general functioning of a child. So if you're looking at using something like the CESD, or the other measures that we mentioned, it will be important to try and use this at the very minimum 4 weeks or every month to assess depression. The CESD and other measures that are used to capture depression and other kinds of psychiatric conditions in kids are important, but they are not sufficient. Often, it's always the case that people are coming in because the problems that they're having are impacting some kind of life situation, whether it be social relationships, family relationships, academics, the CESD and other measures like that might have 1 or 2 items related to those areas of functioning. But it may be important to really personalize your assessment by asking the youth or their caregiver about what are the specific kinds of problems that you have, and if life were to be better, how would it look better? And using that information, that content of the discussion, as ways of framing goals that can be assessed as often as every session in order to, again, gauge whether what you're doing is working, not working, or can be improved upon. So what I'd like to do, we probably would like to do this in about maybe 5 minutes or so, is if there is a volunteer who would like to work with me on developing a sort of dashboard or some monitoring for a particular client, I think that will be a useful exercise not only for whoever the volunteer is, but also for the general audience. So I'm going to pause here, and if there's anyone who would like to, quote, raise your hand and to work with me on a dashboard, that will be great. So any volunteers? Anybody?
I just want to remind everyone there's a raise your hand function. There's a little hand. If you click on that, then you can raise your hand, or you can also chat in the chat box if you'd like to. And we can unmute you, and you can work with Dr. Chaco on your dashboard.
Okay, so Kara, would I assume that we will not have a volunteer?
It doesn't look like we have a volunteer, but does anybody have any questions related to the dashboard that you'd like for us to cover right now? You can chat those in the chat box to the right. And then, Anil, you could go over your case example if you'd like, very briefly.
Sure.
On the dashboard.
Yeah, yes, sure. So again, if there are questions, feel free to provide those. I'm going to just very quickly, perhaps what I'll do is I'm going to share my desktop. Okay. And hold on 1 second here. Kara?
Yes.
Okay. Got scared there for a second. Okay. So let me open up.
Kids are adorable.
Oh, thank you very much. Those are my 2 kids. Not relevant for this discussion. Okay. So what I'd like to do is talk through quickly, because we do actually have a lot of content to cover today aside from the dashboard, how one could use the dashboard to monitor progress, track progress, and make decisions. So we're just going to quickly set something up. So the example that I like to use is the example that I'm going to be using for the remainder of the webinar. I was supervising most recently a a therapist who was working with a 16-year-old Latina female. Her presenting problems were she was referred to the clinic because of school-related issues. She had intermittent school attendance. At intake, we learned that she had some cutting behavior. She met criteria for depression, no anxiety or other kinds of issues. I won't get into her history. The other significant issues were that she had a relationship with a girlfriend who had poorly managed bipolar, and she had uninvolved parents. And so, so this is a pretty typical kind of case for a clinic. It's an adolescent who's having some school problems and relationship problems and having some depression and some cutting behavior. And so there are clearly many things that one wants to track, right? So the first thing is really making sense of whether, see if I can go back to this. Kara, quick question here. How do I go back to the webinar so I can actually have people look through the CESD, et cetera?
Okay, if you put your mouse arrow onto the tab saying View in Anil Chaco's desktop, there's a return button, and I think if you press that, it'll take you back.
There's a return button. There is a stop sharing. So I actually do not, I'm sorry about this. So do I stop sharing?
Stop sharing. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, so let me do that, and then we'll go back to okay. So the first thing is we'd like to take a look at each of these measures and see what will be most appropriate for a 16-year-old. So she has presenting problems related to school and some relationship issues. And so is this just page one, or is there?
If you click the arrows, like the slides, you'll go to page 2.
Page 2. Okay, very good. So we looked at several measures, and just to make a decision about why we chose one over the other. It's important when you're looking at these kinds of general measures to not only make decisions based on if it's appropriate for developmental level, who the informant is, et cetera, but really look at the items to decide, well, are these the kinds of items that the client is saying is problematic? So if things like eating behavior and sleeping are they're not issues, instruments or measures that tap heavily on vegetative kind of depressive symptoms may not be very practical or important for a particular patient. So we found that this particular client had issues with sleeping was a big problem for her, and that contributed to some of her problems getting up and going to school and staying engaged in school. And so we picked a measure. We picked it is the BDI for adolescents because of how much it emphasized not only the vegetative states of depression, but also a lot of the cognitive problems that she was having. So she self-reported as having a lot of negative thoughts about herself and about her situation at school and her relationship. And so unlike other measures, the BDI for adolescents is very thought-heavy or focuses on a lot of cognitive issues in kids. So you can see here the CESD is less likely to do that. So it talks about eating, mood. It talks a bit about, again, mood, a little bit of sleep, et cetera, but not a lot on cognitive distortions. And so when you're making a decision about, well, out of all the different kinds of measures available to assess depression, what are the kinds of items in each of these measures that are going to make most sense for the particular client? And again, for our particular example, the 16-year-old, given that there were a lot of negative cognitions or thinking that was related to her problems, we felt that a measure that assessed for each of these is really important. So we decided on utilizing the BDI for adolescents. Okay, so I'm going to go back to sharing my desktop. Okay. Now, just real quickly, I think this was reviewed both in the general training and as well as the last webinar. Each of the information on the bottom tab here allows you to enter in information particular to for the patient or the client. The first tab all the way to the right includes information on just demographic information. And then here is where you're going to be entering information regarding the measures. So here we have, for this particular client, we're using the BDI for adolescents. We're going to measure it. All right, something's going on with this. Oh, I know why. Sorry. We would measure it on the left. BDI scores that are higher are worse. So we would have a BDI measured on the left. This is our general progress measure. It's a general measure to capture information generally about depression. Now, another important progress measure for this particular kid, this adolescent, was determining what would be important kinds of very individualized behaviors that are easily observable, that can be defined very clearly, and that also was a proxy or represented problems with depression. And we had selected a few. I'm just going to mention one just for the sake of illustration, which was, excuse me, getting to school on time. So school on time. And this was a measure of just yes or no. So here we have two different kinds of progress measures. One is general, and it's nomothetic, and it gives you information on general functioning. One was very specific to the child, and it was essentially just a yes or no. We included other progress measures like number of pleasant activities that the youth engaged in a day, and that was scored as a frequency score. So there is a mix of both general kinds of information one can gather that represents scores on a measure like the BDI, and very idiosyncratic, idiographic kinds of measures that are particular to the patient. Now, the combination of these two things are very important because the BDI allows you not only to get information that is validated and compared to other kids, it allows you to determine whether the depression score is clinically elevated, if it's typical or what should be expected for a particular youth at their age. So it gives you information where you can compare the child or the youth or the client score relative to other people who have filled out the BDI. That represents individuals without mental health problems and people with mental health problems. So the combination of these kinds of measures allows you to take a look at both how the kid is functioning, whether progress is being seen, to make decisions about progress, and to also compare scores relative to other kids that child or that client's age. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and that was quick. If there are other questions about the dashboard or how to use it, absolutely feel free to ask questions and send questions by email as well, and the CTAC team here will be able to field them. Okay. Okay, so in terms of content for today, we're going to be covering, as I mentioned, several practice elements. And I think what's really important here is, although we don't talk about, we won't be talking about today psychoeducation and establishing rapport, et cetera, it's critical that I just mentioned in particular that everyone comes into treatment either not have experienced mental health treatment or have had some experience with mental health treatment, and we want to ensure that people are their expectations are aligned with what's going to be actually occurring in your particular work with the patient. That includes either whether it's the child or if it's the parent. So although we won't be talking about psychoed and engagement, those are particularly important. So as you can see here, we're focusing on several of the more frequent practice elements. So let me get into, we're going to actually skip this just so we can get into some of the CBT work. Okay. So CBT, although in practice-wise, the practice guide, we talk about psychoeducation, the CBT model as a separate practice guide. The most important thing about the CBT model, when you're working with clients who have some aspect of depression, and later on as we get into anxiety, this is also true, everything should be explained in the context of the CBT model. Now, language here is really important because what's the perspective that I have taken, and when I supervise, is not only to help the client learn language that can help them in their immediate situation, but also to develop these skills and to have a language and vocabulary that can be used well beyond their actual participation in formal treatment. So we want clients to be able to understand this model so well and to use the language when they're talking about what's going on. So when they're outside of session, when they have terminated session and it's 3 or 4 months down the line, that they can clearly articulate what it is that they're experiencing. So in the very beginning, it is very important to articulate the difference between well, cognition, emotion, and behavior, or thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And in order to do this, what I tend to do is to start with feelings, because most people can have some grasp of feelings. What is a feeling? How are feelings affected by behavior? Cognitions or thoughts are much more difficult to identify or self-identify for a lot of clients, and so it's something that we talk about after we talk about feelings. It's often the case that we use, and we'll talk quickly about these steps. Well, maybe we'll talk about these steps first. The first part of this is ensuring that individuals understand what moods are. And so what we often use is a feeling thermometer or a mood thermometer, which I believe Tony Salerno had mentioned at the last webinar. This is a nice opportunity for you to engage a client's understanding of the connection between feelings and behavior. So I often start off discussions about trying to teach the model of CBT by asking an adolescent or a child, what would your mood be after getting a present? And rating it on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being just miserable to 10 being elated, and asking the same question in relation to getting into a fight with a friend. And so it's through examples where one can teach clients about the different language or vocabulary for things. And so one would expect that you would have higher ratings for feelings or mood after getting a present. something that you really liked, versus lower ratings or lower mood after getting into a fight with a friend or a family member. Once this is established, you can do multiple examples to make sure that the connection between feelings and moods or behaviors and moods are very clear and evident, and that it's clear to you that the client that you're working with is actually on the same page with you in terms of how feelings may affect mood. Once this is done, we often explain the thought, feeling, and doing, which is the way I like to talk about it with kids and adolescents. So although in the CBT model that's listed here, we term it cognition, emotion, and behavior, it's often thought, feelings, and doings. So what are you thinking, how are you feeling, and what are you doing? And that's the connection that I typically, or the terminology I typically use. Ways of explaining this. Again, this is part of psychoeducation for CBT, and this is really important, again, to ensure that the client is using the same terminology as you, because you would eventually want to use this terminology in subsequent sessions when you're talking about practicing skills. Often we have examples where we would ask the client, here's a particular behavior that's happening. Let's talk about potential thoughts, feelings, and doings that would happen depending on the behavior. So let's say, for example, it's raining. What would be a set of thoughts you could have that's related to raining? And the client would identify things like things that are negative, such as it's raining, it's going to be a miserable day, I'm not going to get to do anything, and then talk about the subsequent feelings that one would have based on this thought, and then how that would impact your behavior or what you actually do. And we could run through different examples, it's raining, or my friend and I just got into a fight, my parents are upset with me. So different behaviors and how thoughts, feelings, and doings relate to each other depending on the particular behavior that happened. And then following this general discussion of identifying and engaging feelings and being able to talk about how behaviors relate to thoughts, feelings, and doing, we would subsequently have the child apply it to their own lives. And there's sort of two ways of doing that. One is asking them to be able to talk about how do you know when you're in a good mood, or how do you know when you're in a bad mood. And that's one way of getting kids to start thinking about how they look when they're in a bad mood. So we would ask questions like, this is how I look or sound to other people when I'm in a bad mood. This is what I would say about myself and my world if I was in a bad mood or a good mood. This is how my body would feel if I were in a bad mood or a good mood. And this is how I would act around others if I were in a bad mood or a good mood. And I know I'm talking about a lot here. We're going to be uploading, or hopefully uploading on the CTAC website some handouts that you can use that has sort of nicely laid out these different kinds of example exercises that you can use with clients to, again, to help them understand, appreciate the language that we're using, and how, again, thoughts, feelings, and doings work together. Once we get a sense of this is how I am when I'm in a good mood, or this is how I am when I'm in a bad mood, both how I'm sounding, how I'm looking, what I say, what I think, and how I act towards others, we try and ensure that we go back to the terminology of thoughts, feelings, and doings, and ensure that people are understanding how these different ways of the messages that we convey to people fall into the way we think, the way we feel, and the way we do things. So just to step back and talk about this particular patient or client that I was working with or supervising, a 16-year-old female with cutting and depression. Her sort of thoughts, feelings, and doings were, her major thought that came about was, life is really difficult and my relationship with my girlfriend is very challenging. There's really no point in getting up to go to bed, to go to school. So she would often stay in bed, and as I mentioned, her parents were not very involved, and so there was no monitoring by parents. And this thinking would make her feel very sad, very angry or disappointed in herself and her inability to control her life. And it led to the doing, which was staying in bed when school started or missing activities. And so it was important for her to be able to articulate her thinking, her feeling and doing in her own language, but be able to communicate with her therapist in a very structured way. Here are my thoughts, here are my feelings associated with it, and here are the behaviors associated with it. Because once you have those things, there are different things, different sort of practice elements that target either thoughts, feelings, or doing or behavior. And that, again, is really important because ultimately all the practice elements all target in some way or another and in a certain intensity those three areas: thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So once we get a pretty good understanding, and let me pause here also to say, how did we get her to actually identify these thoughts? And we can talk about this in greater detail later at a subsequent point. One of the great things about working with adolescents now is that everyone has a smartphone or an iPhone, et cetera. So although the traditional way of tracking things by paper and pencil is still very useful, what we found was because this adolescent was really having a hard time activating herself or being very engaged, we had her monitor everything that was going on the moment that she woke up, because she was right next to her iPhone, by using the record option on her iPhone. And so what would happen is she would wake up oftentimes very late or missing things, and we had her say, you know, whatever you're thinking, imagine you're speaking to someone about it. So just whatever thought that comes to mind, just go ahead and say it and record it. And so that was a useful way for her, again, going back to this idea that your thoughts sometimes are so automatic or sometimes complicated and hard to put together in a coherent way, that sometimes just being able to record what you're thinking by just saying things aloud gives you that information that you need, that you can use to target those thoughts subsequently. So that was very useful in terms of working with this particular adolescent. In terms of subsequent things to do in order to work with thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, the major kinds of thought patterns that are problematic for kids often fall under this acronym, which is part of the PEDS material, which we'll be able to supply you. It's called BLUE, B-L-U-E. So the major thought patterns that are often problematic for adolescents or for clients, kids in particular, are B, blaming myself, L, looking for bad news, U, unhappy guessing, and E, exaggerating. So although there are plenty of cognitive distortions out there, maladaptive ways of thinking about the world and yourself, a helpful way of teaching kids how to identify a particular thought pattern or a thought in general that might be problematic is teaching them the acronym BLUE, B-L-U-E, and it happens to work well with depression. So B is for blaming myself, L is for looking for bad news, and U is for unhappy guessing, and E is for exaggerating. So When we get past the phase of trying to help clients go out and monitor or identify thoughts, feelings, and doings, we want to do something with that information. So for this particular patient, this example, the 16-year-old female, she was often blaming herself. So her cognitions were, this is my fault, that things aren't better, that school isn't going well, that my family isn't doing well, that my relationship with my girlfriend was what it was. So she was often blaming herself, and she was able to identify that that was one of the maladaptive ways of thinking about things. She also often exaggerated what would be the potential consequences for things happening. So if I have to interact or spend time with my family, then things are going to get much worse, and they're going to throw me out of the house because they don't love me, as an example. So once this information, once you gather information from the particular client around thoughts, feelings, and doings, one method of working with or providing skills for a particular client around the thinking is to help them identify whether the thoughts relate to one of the blue cognitions or maladaptive thinking. Again, blaming yourself, looking for bad news, unhappy guessing, and exaggerating. And then there are other kinds of skills that can be taught related again to this idea of cognition is the acronym TRUE, which is essentially trying to combat the statements, the maladaptive cognition that is occurring by asking specific questions. I think we have it here. So here are some of the challenges that one can do. This is at the cognitive level. What's the evidence that that this thought is actually true? Is there another way of looking at it? So is there another perspective that you're not thinking about that might be appropriate? What would you tell a friend who had this thought? So if I interact with my parents, things are going to get worse and they're going to throw me out of the house. If you had to tell a friend who made that statement to you, what would you tell them? And what if this is true? What would that really be so bad? And so many maladaptive cognitions, even if they are true, are often not the end of the world. And it's important for clients to recognize that even when bad things happen, they don't mean that that the world is going to end. And that's often a maladaptive cognition for a lot of people with depression. There are also other kinds of skills that would be helpful. So finding social support, family and friends, finding other activities to distract. There's also an acronym called TLC, which is also part of the PEDS material, which is talking to a friend, which is, again, finding social support. Looking for the silver lining, that's the L. So thinking about alternative perspectives and what good can come out of a bad situation. And C, which is changing the channel, which is often using distraction as a way of moving past getting stuck in the moment. So for some youth, it may be very difficult if they have a cognition that they seem to say, there's a lot of evidence for it, I'm looking at all the perspectives, this still makes a lot of sense, it is really problematic, it would be a real problem if it actually happened. Sometimes they're really stuck in the moment, and what's often best is to do something at the behavioral level, which is the doing part, getting them to do something different. And that's part of activity scheduling, which we'll actually get into right now. actually, no. We'll be doing
Hey, Neil, I'm
monitoring.
going to interrupt you just quickly because I have a question
Sure.
that came up. I think it may be valuable for others. The
Sure.
question is, how are you able to stay focused on cognitive development when the family is very crisis oriented? We can't seem to get through it and have the client participate. Would you be able to speak to that really quickly?
Sure. So I think this was described as the crisis of the week, or the COW, during training. And during training, I think we discussed quite a bit about the importance of both appreciating that these COWs happen, ensuring that sufficient attention is brought to trying to understand the crisis, scheduling it in as part of the agenda. And those are all important things. So for this particular example, as an example, the 16-year-old, there were often things that happen or were related to her girlfriend with this poorly managed bipolar disorder and the girlfriend's parents. And so this wasn't necessarily unrelated to treatment. But what we tried to do, and this goes back to this idea of CBT as a model, is to help frame the problem or the crisis of the week as an opportunity to practice utilizing the CBT model in order for, in order for allowing either the client, the adolescent, or the parent understand and appreciate that this model, the way we're thinking about things, can be incorporated into more broader things than just the presenting problem of the particular client. For things that are probably very distally related, issues related to housing, financial situations, etc., we can always talk about it in the context of CBT. So, for instance, an event happens. Let's just say it's your the landlord saying, you're going to be evicted, or there's some problem in your apartment and it has to be dealt with, and that causes a lot of stress for the parent or the guardian. And one way of trying to incorporate that into treatment is saying, this is a really important problem. I know that this is probably the most important thing for you, and I agree with you that this is something that we should discuss and see how I can be helpful. Placing in the agenda as here's that X amount of time that we can use to discuss it. And as the discussion goes on, always using the terminology that we use in CBT, either the thoughts, the feelings, and the behaviors as a way of teaching the parent to use those skills so they can use them for these crises that happen. So, for instance, I wonder what you were thinking when that happened, when you got that phone call. What were your feelings like? And how did that impact your behavior? So let's talk about how you address some of those cognitions. Perhaps this is really bad. Perhaps if this actually happened, things really would be bad. What are the kinds of behaviors that you can utilize, or skills that we can talk about to help, or we talk about to help around this situation? So although we have not talked about this yet, we're going to go here. This is a great opportunity to talk about problem solving. So problem solving is a skill that we would teach kids, clients, in CBT for depression, but also a useful skill to use when trying to work with parents who are coming in with the crisis of the week and saying, well, here's another thing that's happened. Well, it's, okay, that's great. You know what? We've talked about with your kid, and we've talked about with you this idea that a lot of what happens and the way we think about things often impact the way we feel. One step that seems to be very practical that we're teaching or working with your child on is using problem solving. So obviously there's more to it than this, and given the time that we have to get into this, but I would encourage people to address the crisis of the week, because it's going to come up whether you like it or not, but do it in a structured way that integrates it back into what's being taught with the kid and the parent. So reframing it as, yes, we can talk about this, but let's talk about it in a particular context so you can continue to use the skills that you're learning here in treatment to apply it for things that are broader than just, your child's depression. Because CBT, as was mentioned in the last webinar, is an important way or framework of thinking about issues beyond just depression or anxiety. It can be very useful in everyday life circumstances. So that would be the way I would say, in a very, I know, not sufficient way, but again, given the time that we have here, that's the way I would suggest when I supervise therapists, is saying, let's not use this, let's use this as a teachable moment and integrate it back into the way we think about the problems that the kid is having and how we teach skills. Let's do the same thing with the parents, but make sure it's very time limited. Otherwise, you're going to spend your whole time doing this and you'll never move, you'll never have enough sufficient time with your client to move things forward. Is that helpful, Kara?
Yes, very helpful. Thanks, Anil.
Okay, good. So it's amazing how quickly, the time has gone. We have, and it's not surprising because cognitive strategies are often the crux of CBT, and trying to understand the terminology and the vocabulary and trying to teach it and illustrate it to kids and getting clients to understand the vocabulary and use it themselves is an essential component to making everything else work. If people are using different language or different vocabulary to term things, it becomes much more challenging to integrate the other components of CBT, the other practice elements for depression, without that similar vocabulary or terminology. So although we spent essentially the majority of our time today on cognitive strategies and thinking about CBT, psychoeducation, and the model itself, hope that people appreciate that this is where everything starts. If you can get kids to use the same language or have language that they can communicate with you, that separates out thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, then that's the start of being able to work on integrate other practice elements into strategies or as a toolkit that can target these things differently. So with that said, I'm going to stop here and see if there's any other questions.
Hey, Anil, I wanted to just interject again and tell everyone that we didn't get to a lot of the content because you gave such great content in this presentation, and there's more to cover. So the week of August 19th, we're going to have another webinar. We'll get back to you with the details as soon as possible. That way we can make sure to give you as much content as possible, okay? So if you have any other questions for Anil or for anyone, please chat them in the chat box, and then we'll be wrapping this up. Do you have any idea, I have one question and then we'll wrap it up. Do you have any ideas for using this with younger children? So there's someone that I know personally that has working with a 4-year-old and younger kids. Do you have any ideas around this?
Yeah, that obviously is much more challenging because the big piece of, well, one big piece of CBT is the cognitive part. And so there's an issue there. It's more complicated given that at that age, children are still developing language, and so what they think and what they're able to express may not be in parallel. So they might be thinking a lot of things, but not able to say a lot of things in terms of what they're thinking. So we often, with little kids, we will use play as an opportunity to talk about particular situations, and helping kids through play instead of a discussion like you would with an adolescent as a way of modeling what might be going on in the child's life. Again, as a therapist, being able to keep the thought feeling and behavior model in mind when you're having this play. So that should always be the framework. But as you're having this opportunity to play with a kid, you can say, using your own experiences, this was something that was tough for me, and I role play, having friends or dolls as friends and saying, my friend said this, and it made me think that he didn't like me, so I felt sad, and then I decided to walk away and go home. And so again, this is a very superficial way of thinking about this, but it's in line with that way of thinking is use contexts that allow kids the opportunity not to specifically identify their own thinking in an abstract way, have them role play things, problems or challenges that might be identified by their parents or other adults, and use play as an opportunity to get at that thinking or doing or feeling. And that would be my suggestion.
Okay, great. So I think we're going to wrap up today. Thank you so much, Anil, and thank you to all of you participants for being with us today. We hope that you found this helpful, and we're going to be in touch as soon as possible about another webinar to go over the rest of these common elements around depression. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'm going to if you could pass me the ball, Anil, or go to the last slide to show our contact information, that would be really helpful. Okay, great. I'm just going to go to the last slide so everybody can see our contact information. So these are the next steps. This is the next the dates for you. The next webinar is not in here, but it will be sent to you soon, like I said, and this is looking ahead around anxiety, and this is all of our contact information. So I hope you all have a wonderful day, and please be in touch if you have any questions or concerns, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks again, Anil.
Okay, bye now.
And thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.